General Sundarji found himself inside Pakistan raising the Indian tricolour on 15th of August 1947 in Pakistan, which is a rarity. I do not know how many people would have done that. Would have taken a long time. So General James Singh says, it'll take months, few months. So General Sundarji says, why are we talking mules in this era? Why not helicopters? So that was the first time an entire brigade was airlifted to Zimitang. In 1962, the Chinese occupied the heights. Indian soldiers were on the floor before the war happened. Quarter of a century later, the Indians were on the heights and the Chinese were on the floor.
Exactly.
So you'll see that, after the death of Mrs. Gandhi, the arrival of Rajiv Gandhi, a lot of technocrats. Now, they didn't have much of an experience, but they had a lot of desire to change India. And they were all young people, and Rajiv Gandhi had brought them on board. And here was a chief who was willing to use that technology, who was also thinking. So they were actually singing from the same hymn sheet. So it so happened that you had a political dispensation who was also on the same page as him. So when Rajiv Gandhi asked General Sundarji whether he would be able to take on the LTTE, should they oppose the Indian forces, should they take on the Indian forces militarily, General Sundarji's response was that LTTE would be decimated in 2 to 3 weeks. General Sundarji, if you notice, was built for the big war strategy, the classical war maneuvers against traditional adversaries such as Pakistan and China.
Hello and welcome once again to Kitaabi Baatein, a podcast where we make sense of India and the world through books. My guest today is a very special person, ex-Indian Army veteran, a prolific author, and someone whom I admire both as an author and as a person. Please welcome Probal Dasgupta.
Thank you.
Probal,
Thank you, Abhishek.
Honor to have you on Kitaabi Baatein. I
Thank
remember
you.
last time we met, we did an online session.
Yes.
And today with the third book out,
Right.
we are having an offline here in Delhi.
Right.
So probably your third book, General Brasstacks, the Sundarji Story. Now I'm sure many people, including me, they were unaware of General Sundarji. Probably you choose to write on topics, on people which people are unaware of. Your first book, 1967,
Right.
it was an event which I guess hardly anyone would be aware of. Then आपने camouflage लिखा जिसपे बहुत सी ऐसी stories people didn't know.
Right.
General Sundarji, and this book was in some ways was a shocker, and I knew the events which surrounded his tenure, very critical events. The man who modernized Indian Army, the man who talked about India becoming a nuclear power, the man who was an expert in geopolitics as well, as you mentioned towards the last part of the book, what views he had on the future of, say, America, China, Kashmir, many things. So many firsts are credited to him. He's the one who did not bow before the Chinese pressure and airlifted a troop to ensure that China gets a befitting reply. इतना कुछ हुआ, and yet लोगों को इनका नाम भी usually नहीं पता. Why you think that happened?
Thank you, Abhishek, for having me on the show, and really appreciate and look forward to a wonderful discussion. Great question to start with. Look, what we do as a nation, the way we read our history, is to regurgitate the same things. Unfortunately, that has been the thing that I have always have railed against. That if you look at our history, at Sam Manekshaw, great field marshal, great general, glorious victory, but so many books on him.
Yes.
There's a movie on him. There'll be more books on him. So that tends to become the order of the day. We keep writing on Mahatma Gandhi. We'll keep writing on Mahatma Gandhi. We'll keep writing on 1962, and we'll keep writing. So I think one of the things that I have held against the writing order of history is that we continue to regurgitate what is going on and what has been already been said. The idea was to talk about someone who had actually had an impact on an entire decade that was turbulent, tumultuous, absolutely stormy decade, one of the most stormiest decades. And we have had the highs and the lows, every kind. It was the first time, I'm just digressing, the first time India won the Cricket World Cup.
Yes.
First time India sent a man to space. We have forgotten his name. There is no book on Rakesh Sharma.
Rakesh Sharma.
Yes. So we are always, regurgitating, talking about the same things.
Right.
So when someone asked me, can you write a book on Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw? That's how it started.
Okay.
I said, no, how can I add anything that has already been written? There was a movie being made at that time,
Okay.
which was Bain Data.
Right.
And there were so many things that were being spoken about Sam. I said, I can't really add any value. So the way to look at it is I try and see what is it that I could add value, which is of relevance
Right.
to readers, especially, people across the spaces. And Sundarji was somebody who impacted not just the military space, but the political dispensation, the thinking, India's destiny, a lot of things. You mentioned the events, and I think that's what determined and when I looked up, there was no book on him.
Exactly.
So that is what
Exactly.
made my belief stronger that yes, there has to be a book on him, and I'm going to write it.
The man who probably redefined the entire military strategy of India, who talked about as nuclear weapons. And everything.
Right.
So coming to the book, if we start with his initial years and especially the party, I think he joined the army in 45. And interestingly, he got commissioned in 49, as you mentioned.
46 he joined. And he wanted to join the war. He wanted to be at the war. Just imagine, there is a Tamil Brahmin coming from Madras those days, reading about the Second World War. So I always try to visualize the context under which people would have taken a certain decision. A young man father was an engineer, coming from a non-military home in Madras in Tamil Nadu, wanting to join and see the World War, because that is what he said, that's the way I could go and see the world.
Right.
The World War ended. He ended joining up the army post-war.
Yes.
But before independence.
And he also witnessed partition. I think his own unit was supposed to be moved. And of course, how do you think all those events and his childhood shaped him as a person?
So one thing, Abhishek, I found is that his life ran parallel to the destiny of the nation, especially post-independence India. And it starts from a time when the country was about to gain independence and also be partitioned into two different countries, the whole one big land. And General Sundarji found himself inside Pakistan raising the Indian tricolor on 15th of August 1947 in Pakistan, which is a rarity. I do not know how many people would have done that. And and it was not that it was slated he was scheduled to do that.
Right.
He had asked for the 3 pieces of cloth and asked the local tailor that, stitch me the tricolor with saffron, white and green. And the tricolor went up, which is remarkable. And it also tells you the much about the man, a youngster, 19-year-old, doing this. Then you spoke about partition, the willpower of working through partition and seeing the horrors of partition, seeing deaths on both sides, impacted him in a way that, though, in later years, he was very much determined to do what he needed to do, very decisive in his decision making. There was also a human angle to every aspect of his life, which is also reflected in his personal interactions, whether it is with friends and family and others. So he saw that very early on as a young teenager. Then he comes to India. He also participates. Again, he was rescuing refugees across the border. And then he finds himself leading Mahatma Gandhi's funeral. So if you look at it, these are significant events in history. And he finds himself on the sidelines. It's as if watching it from the sidelines, that this is what is unfolding. And not just watching it from the sidelines, somewhere he's a part of it too. Because he leads Mahatma Gandhi's funeral cavalcade, which is remarkable for a young officer. And then he gets commissioned. So he sees that break from, the colonial times into post-independence era. And it plays on in his head that, we were still following colonial customs, the way we were traveling in trains, the kind of luxurious coaches. And it was a spillover from the British era, tiger hunting, game hunting, which was also there. And he talks about it. He said, I didn't like the whole idea of shooting animals, which was also a fallout of where we are. But it also documents the era that we lived in.
Yes.
His life is something that is kind of a, sort of running along parallelly to the country's evolution post independence. So I call him someone who was a our post independence protagonist as a military protagonist, because he got, and I think he's the last officer who was commissioned before independence to become chief.
Chief, yes.
So that is, and the first officer after the Second World War to become chief. Right. So he has many firsts and right through the early stages.
And as you always say, people are a product of their times. So when you evaluate someone, you typically have to look at the situation, the circumstances as well. So we'll talk about that, especially the 5 assassinations which are linked some way or the other. That is not to say that he was involved, but 5 assassinations, his tenure is somewhere he's at the center of those. Sure. But before that, as you consulted a lot of army veterans, you consulted even his family, Aruna Roy ji, and his son, Vikram Sundarji. How you think how he was as a person, not as a military man, but as a person in socially or with family?
So I spoke with Aruna ji, and Vikram I couldn't speak with, but I've his emails and something that he wrote were useful to get his thoughts into the book. I also spoke with his stepdaughter Jayanti. And that's how I got her views and the views of General Sundarji's second wife. But to your question, when I spoke with Aruna, for instance, and she was very helpful in terms of letting me know about her interactions with General Sundarji. She found him again when she was growing up. Let's put the context in order here. She was growing up as a young kid, and General Sundarji was her uncle. Yeah. And he was a young man coming back from his field postings. She was the one who he would interact with, who would talk to. And they, struck up a great rapport as uncle and niece. And that happened. Subsequently, Aruna Roy's journey was more towards activism.
Yes.
Whereas General Sundarji was a military chief. Very different journeys, diametrically opposite, you could say. But one of the things that Arunaji told me was that her interactions were also not devoid of debates and discussions that were full of differences between the two.
Okay.
Yeah, because she believed in some other form of addressing life, whereas she thought he was, because he was a military general, he would talk about strategy, and that might appear hawkish to her.
Completely different perspectives on life and society.
And they continually differed.
Yeah.
But they also discussed all the time. So they kind of celebrated the differences. One of the things that I understand from my interactions with the family is that he must have been a military officer in the office and in official times. But coming back to family, he would love his, curd rice. He would love his, the home food, the Tamil food. He would love all of that. And he would eat with hand at home. So he was very much he had his private life, which was secluded from his official avatar.
Right.
And then there are incidents with Vikram Sundarji that, he would ask him to sort of look at he was fond of wildlife and others, and that's why he hated the game hunting part. Right. He talks to Vikram Sundarji, who was little then, and he's talking about how they should be protective about the animals and birds and others around them. And so there was this whole aspect of being human. So the other thing that, as I said, he would celebrate differences with different people. So I think opinions were always welcome. Some of the things that he quite enjoyed in terms of, he would welcome an opinion if that was informed, because he was always trying to, improve himself.
Right.
From the childhood, he was introduced to music and arts and, and books. So as he grew up, that formed a part of his personality.
Right.
The family would read a lot of Woodhouse.
That was a family favorite, you mentioned.
That was a family favorite. and he would listen to a lot of music. His sister played one of the instruments very well. Sundarji would sit around and listen to her. So some of those things inject uh, uh, different facets into the personality, making it a rather wholesome personality. In fact, interestingly, when the book is out, you have several other people writing in. One of the very interesting people who wrote to me was his nephew.
Okay.
Yes, who lives in Bangalore, and he's the son of Sundarji's younger sister,
Okay.
Sudha. So he wrote to me and he read the book. Unfortunately, I couldn't get to interview him before the book when the research was on. But he wrote glowingly about how the memories were brought back.
Right.
And some of the personal interactions he treasured. All of these people who I met called General Sundarji their favorite. So that tells us how much he enjoyed
Being with the
being with
family,
others.
relatives.
Of course, there were issues in terms of his which I write about,
Yes.
his long-standing absence because of his service in Congo, elsewhere. So there were times when he and his son and the family kind of there was space, there was a lot of distance that started to happen over the years. That did happen. So let's not mince words there. There was there were differences between him and his son, which became a distance which was not really bridged by the time he passed away. So, when you're a public figure, it can happen when you are involved in so many things. But I think that is something that also was part of his life, which one cannot run away from. There was a distance between him and his children, which happened over the years. Having said that, he was also someone who encouraged dissent and differences and amongst younger officers. We have a few anecdotes from there as well.
This reminds me of an instance wherein he was more like an atheist. He saw religious violence during partition.
Right.
And I think you mentioned that his son asked if there's no God and who created this sea, stars, everything.
Yes.
And since then, he became a little more open towards religion and
Yeah.
somehow started believing in God.
Right.
So that also shows a connect. But yes, as you said, this disconnect grows because of long absences from the
Yes.
house.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that is the nature of the job. I mean, you can't be a military man while staying at
Not
home. You have to
always,
be,
but but it's also driven by the interpersonal relationship in each case.
In each case.
In this case, there was a distance that grew,
Right.
that sent them apart
Right.
for a long period of time.
So coming back to the key events, and as you discuss, a man is a product of his times and vice versa as well. Operation Falcon. Now he did not bow to the Chinese pressure because India did not have a very great, track record when it came to dealing with the Chinese.
Right.
And yet in 1986, he showed the courage and airlifted a brigade to make the Chinese understand that no, we will not bow against the pressure. Now today when we talk of the Naya Bharat and it will take revenge.
Right.
That was again a very good instance of India not bowing down to the pressure. If you can explain a bit about Operation Falcon.
Yes. So let's understand the context again. It was in an area where the Chinese had started the war in 1962.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've always seen with the Chinese is that they love to exert psychological domination.
Yes.
They are not as adventurous as the Pakistanis, but they are fond of having that kind of a psychological domination exerted over the adversary, which then translates into holding the upper edge, and then pushing the adversary towards negotiations, which are in their favor. So that's their preferred tactic.
True.
In 1987, like I said, 24 years, 1986, about 24 years, quarter of a century after 1962, the Chinese had started to occupy certain areas ahead of the Indian positions. Which were those areas? This was this areas around the 1962 part, which is near Namkachu, Thagla Ridge. Yes. This was at Sumdorong Chu, close by. Now, what was the trigger? The trigger was that India was making fortifications, defenses. India had also given signals about the announcement of a new state, which they did, which was Arunachal Pradesh. That set the cat amongst the pigeons as far as China is concerned. And slowly, you had 100 Chinese soldiers at a place and 200. Then they started building a helipad out there, which was a matter of concern for India. General Sundarji thought about it. He was visiting the divisional headquarters, and the division commander, General James Singh, was someone who was briefing General Sundarji. Sundarji said, we need the defenses in the forward locations as early as possible. Otherwise, the Chinese are going to occupy the heights and going to move in, and they're going to outflank us. Because we had held certain positions in the forward locations, but we needed to really beef up those positions, and quickly so. He said, how many days would it need? General James Singh says, he calculates the mule loads. Traditionally, the Indian Army, like I said, the British used to do this, carry mule loads and of equipment up the mountains, and using mules to take up the equipment and guns and everything would have taken a long time. So General James Singh says, it'll take months, few months. So General Sundarji says, why are we talking mules in this era? Why not helicopters? So that was the first time an entire brigade was airlifted to Zimitang. Within weeks, the Indian Army was on top of the mountain, was on top of the heights, Lungrola and the other ridges around. They had created helipads. He had also integrated the Air Force into his plans. This was again something we talk about today, integration of three forces. This was thought of by General Sundarji for the first time, and effectively so in a very short span of time, he had put the defenses in order to really rattle the Chinese. The psychological difference that the Chinese wanted to make had a different impact on them. What was that psychological impact? In 1962, the Chinese occupied the heights. Indian soldiers were on the floor. Before the war happened. Quarter of a century later, the Indians were on the heights and the Chinese were on the floor. This was something that was dealt to the Chinese. They had dealt a blow to the Chinese that rattled them. That was a trigger for the Chinese to come to the negotiation table. Rajiv Gandhi was invited to China 2 years later, and it started a long series of negotiations. And a lot of people will say that, Sundarji had triggered this thing which could have led to a clash or a conflict. But let me tell you that the Chinese are not immediately, interested in a conflict. They would test out your resolve, test out your psychological ambition, what do you want to do? And they thought that India would be defensive and cautious and tentative as usual, but they were not. Now, he also took a page of General Sagat Singh's book in 1967, 20 years earlier. General Sagat Singh had deployed the old school tenets of speed, surprise, which actually works. But speed, surprise and execution. So executing that speed and with speed and surprise your plans is something that really rattled the Chinese, which had happened in 1967, again happened 20 years later. And that was the difference. And we could talk about how he actually differed with the Prime Minister on this.
So this brings another very important question, a very important aspect of his tenure, modernizing the army. His thinking was modern. It was a break away from the past. And he was the one who was very open about being aggressive. Earlier it was more reactive. Now we were aggressive. And also modernize the army in terms of the equipments, artilleries, everything. Which we believe led the foundation for an absolutely, a new era of the army. Now today we talk about AI and new weapons and all, but that time situation was different. On that particular aspect, how do you think he was different from other army chiefs? And did it affect the political decision making in any way? And how did it exactly laid the foundation for the modernization of the army?
So what had happened was, after 1971, and it is but natural that you have a big glorious victory of 1971, after which India thought that, look, everything is done. Pakistan has been partitioned. You have Bangladesh, new country. Pakistan has gone back. So we had achieved this glorious victory, after which in the 1970s, not much happened. When 80s came about, for instance, here was General Sundarji, who had come from a course in the US in Fort Leavenworth, who came to India. And he was part of the Defense Restructuring Committee in the 1970s, wherein he sees some of these things that are needed to be implemented.
Yeah.
One of the thoughts he had from 65 and 71 wars was not the victory. He believed that India and Pakistan had locked horns in the Punjab area and India not made much progress, which was something that he noted, and he realized that he needed to create a different kind of an army, which was about the future, which was not in the past. And we were fighting past wars.
Past wars.
And which was an outcome of the British doctrine again. So when he comes back from the US, and the US by then had become a superpower,
Yes.
and so was the Soviet Union, he had these newer ideas of mechanization, maneuverability, firepower, aggression, initiative. So he comes back to India, and I call him a destiny's child, because he finds himself in very important positions. For example, as the commandant of the War College in Mao, he gets to test some of his plans, test some of his ideas. He makes the tanks go 8 times more than they were actually happening, and that irked a lot of people. But he was bringing in this change. So that was mobility. Right. He wanted that kind of mobility. Then came, the firepower that he wanted to create. He wanted to get, and then we have Bofors, we have some of these things. So he wanted to have that kind of firepower. Right. He spoke about nuclear strategy. Nobody had spoken about that. And something, like you said, the modernization involved the use of technology.
Yes.
One of the features was that when Brasstacks was happening, that was happening with the briefings on a large screen. Now, nobody had seen that.
Right.
He was urging young officers to use computers in 1983-84. Nobody knew what were they thought that must have been some boxes with some screens.
Right.
Nobody understood why he was doing that. He said, this is where your future lies. He was also somebody who pushed for the air defense,
yes,
which played a critical role in Sindoor.
Talked about nuclearizing,
yes,
nuclear weapons and all. Yeah.
Yes. So when he comes back, he says the Soviet Union and the Americans are neighbors, but then they have intercontinental ballistic missiles, hundreds and thousands firing, possibly stockpiling those nuclear weapons to fire at each other. He said, we need to contextualize our geography to what we need. We don't need that kind of a thing. We need 15 to 20 weapons. That's when he starts to think about all of that.
Right.
He talks about dissuasive deterrence with China, in which the idea was that, you have nuclear weapons to deter China from taking you on. He also spoke about punitive deterrence with Pakistan, which meant that if Pakistan were to fire a nuclear weapon, our capability should be such that they would completely obliterate Pakistan's ability to mount another strike. So that was so he had a method in the madness, and he also was about where do you go from here?
Yeah.
He wanted to integrate technology with a human capability. So he called it the man-machine mix. Up until then, nobody had spoken about all of this. Absolutely. And he spoke about a whole-of-nation approach, where he spoke about technology, use of technology by the forces.
Absolutely.
And also integrating the 3 services into one big national plan, which we see in Brasstacks, when all of these different ministries, different services, they're all used to actually, we talk about whole of nation approach all the time, but this was an example of how a whole of nation approach is thought of, conceptualized, and executed on ground.
Right. Let's now talk about the controversial part. So Brasstacks is one. And one related question to Brasstacks is, like in Bofors and all, so he was someone who defined the relation between army and politics, diplomacy, everything. Do you think this was a practical move, or do you think it was in a way a bit controversial, in a sense trying to redefine the army political relationship? Was it a positive or a negative in your view?
See, I think if we look at the developments around that time, so you'll see that, after the death of Mrs. Gandhi, the arrival of Rajiv Gandhi, a lot of technocrats.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't have much of an experience, but they had a lot of desire to change India. And they were all young people, and Rajiv Gandhi had brought them on board. And here was a chief who was willing to use that technology, who was also thinking. So they were actually singing from the same hymn sheet. So it so happened that you had a political dispensation who was also on the same page as him. The difference was that the political dispensation did not have the experience.
Right.
He had it. So he found himself in the driver's seat. They were very impressed by the way he spoke about technology. He had a gift of the gab. The way he explained how this would be necessary. The way he spoke about nuclear strategy. All of this impressed the minister then, particularly Arun Singh was the Minister of State for Defense. Again, one of the finest ministers we had. So I think Sundarji also had people who had his ears.
Right.
And something that helped as well. Some of those things may or may not have worked out in the outcome part of some of these events. But one of the things that we see, he was very decisive. He found himself in that juncture of history where the political dispensation was also willing to listen to him. And like I said, they were new. He'd been speaking of certain things which they were encouraged by, in terms of what they wanted.
Right.
And I think that it was a marriage of the like-minded. I think that's
In a way, it was a departure from year like 1962, wherein you often say that India was not prepared because they did not understand the Chinese threat. But here in 80s, we are talking about a government where the government and the military were on the same page that yes, we need to modernize it and everything. Do you see that as a departure from
that was a
60s?
departure, and he presented his 15-year plan just as he entered office. So one of the things he did was to have a vision, a plan.
Right.
He was somebody who had a vision. So when he presented the vision, the government, Mr. Arun Singh and others, took to it because they said, this is what we want to do. And the political dispensation was also cutting away from the bureaucracy and the old school politician style of functioning of Mrs. Gandhi and the others. And this was a new era which they wanted to herald. And this guy, the general, was there who was willing to take it forward.
This is interesting. We talk about wo forward-looking the, futurist the, everything was there. Yet some of the key decisions or the key actions which were taken, they all are controversial. If we start with the Operation Brasstacks. About half, or I would say at least 40% of the armed forces were deployed. So 4 se 5 lakh, I think you mentioned.
Right.
They were deployed, and it was more like a simulation of a war. There were chances of, a war happening.
Right.
The tensions were diffused later on, as we saw, through cricket diplomacy, as we said. What do you think, क्या अचीव करा ऑपरेशन ब्रास टैक्स ने, और जनरल सुंदर जी का ये करने का आपके व्यू में क्या मोटिव रहा होगा?
देखिए, ब्रास टैक्स के कुछ एक उद्देश्य थे. एक तो जैसे मैंने कहा कि मैन्यूवरेबिलिटी, फायर पावर, पेनिट्रेशन, एबिलिटी ऑफ तीनों फोर्सेस को इंटीग्रेट करके इकट्ठे मूव कराना. ऑल ऑफ दोज थिंग्स हैपेंड. एयर फोर्स वाज इन्वॉल्व्ड. देयर वाज अ नेवी प्लान टू ले ब्लॉकेड टू द port of Karachi.
Yeah.
So all of those things actually happened. So it took place from a time that, the Prime Minister asked the three chiefs, have we had this kind of movement, that kind of testing of our strengths? So ye baat ahem hai ki testing our strengths, that was one of the objectives. That can we integrate our movement, can we work in harmony, the three services, in a simulated condition of war. And which was the aim, the objective to do so. The objective of Brasstacks was also to see where you can actually, how much capability India would have to defend against Pakistan in areas across Punjab, when in 1965 and 71 they had the Pakistanis and the Indians had, like I said, they had locked horns, and they had so. There was a plan to that. The plan was to hold the Pakistan forces in Punjab, draw them there, and simulate strikes through the deserts of Rajasthan into Pakistan, cutting off Sindh, which was in turmoil that time, and possibly target the Kahuta nuclear facility. that was a plan which they had thought of. Now, when I say plan, that was a plan of the exercise.
Right.
The interpretation was that the exercise was probably done to provoke Pakistan to making the first move, upon which India had the capability to go through the deserts and go into Sindh and bifurcate Pakistan 500 kilometers inside. There are analysts and observers from across the world who said and who wrote, Devin Haggerty wrote, and I quote him there, that India had the capability to actually finish the war in 4 to 6 weeks or maybe a little more. Because Pakistan did not have the capability to withstand that kind of an attack by the Indian forces, which they had amassed. Pakistan was also doing 2 exercises on their side, that those exercises continued because they thought one was in the north and one was in the south, and Bahawalpur Khairpur axis was the southern one, and they were actually rattled that you have General Sundarji, who's a maverick general who can actually execute a plan and say, well, looks good, we could go in. So they were not sure what the Indian plan was. So Brasstacks is possibly was thought of as a smokescreen to get India to really power through the deserts of Rajasthan. And that is also spoken about the last possible conventional war that India and Pakistan could have had before both turned nuclear in 1990 and 99. So this led Ziaul Haq to come here and some of those things that I write about, which led to his death as well.
And death part is interesting. We will come to that, the 5 assassination thing. But before that, one question on the Sri Lanka debacle. So it is said that it was kind of either unnecessary, or that controversy is that was it wrong on General Sundarji's part to send the armed forces, or was it a failure of the intelligence? Because it is very clear that we did not see the real trouble. We underestimated, the adversary's strengths and everything. And it ended in a debacle, a disaster. What do you think was the actual reason? Was it General Sundarji's wrong estimation? Was it a failure of diplomacy or intelligence, or a mix of everything?
See, Abhishek, what had happened was that if we place it in the continuum of time, in 1986-87, there was the high of China. You had bested China at Sumdorong Chu. You had done Brasstacks, had got the Pakistani president arrive here for cricket diplomacy. So there was a high that we were riding. General Sundarji had, by that time, he had been at the tail end of his tenure, towards the tail end of his tenure, the second half, say. And there must have been a kind of hubris, overconfidence, wherein he thought that, look, this is something that we could be done in a few weeks. So when Rajiv Gandhi asked General Sundarji whether he would be able to take on the LTTE, should they oppose the Indian forces, should they take on the Indian forces militarily, General Sundarji's response was that LTTE would be decimated in 2 to 3 weeks, which was also an underestimation and a misleading understanding of the adversary's strengths and capabilities. General Sundarji, if you notice, was built for the big war strategy, the classical war maneuvers against traditional adversaries such as Pakistan and China. This was something that he did not have much patience for, these complex, dirty little wars, as we call it, because they have so many pehlu, itne sare stakeholders and others. And so that is something he had not bargained for. One of the other things he had not bargained for in Sri Lanka was the fact that there were several stakeholders on our own side who were not in sync with each other, which included the political line of thinking, the intelligence and the others. So, you had the army, the intelligence and the political thinking operating in 3 different silos, and they did not speak with each other, which collectively was a result, which collectively kind of resulted in that failure and blunder in Sri Lanka that happened. And I also mention it as India's Vietnam, because that was a learning. That was a learning that happened. We went in there. General Sundarji his decision was not correct, but I must not lay the entire blame at his door. It was a primarily political decision, which is in the military is an instrument of political decision making, right? So he can only advise the prime minister.
Right.
But there were the others. There was Jane Dikshit, who was the high commissioner there.
Yeah.
In his book, he talks about the fact that Sundarji advised the prime minister, but then what were they doing? What were the others doing? What was their advice?
Right.
I don't think anybody advised against going there. They were as much complicit as the political dispensation and anybody else. So I think Sri Lanka was a blunder. It was a collective blunder. And I would say it was not General Sundarji's call alone. His advice was wrong.
Collective
but the blunder
decision and-
was an overall national blunder, wrong decision taken by the government then.
Right. The more controversy which we have is Operation Blue Star. He was not the army general at that time and
Right.
the Bofors scandal and all. And of course, the 5 assassinations.
Right.
So how do you see? I mean, was he in the wrong place at the wrong time, or he was just there when the events of history were happening? Because
Right.
4 head of states, including that of Mrs.
Right.
Indira Gandhi itself, the only army chief who was assassinated in India is General Baatein. इस सब ताने बाने में वो थे. How do you see that?
So, that's a very interesting question. See, what happens is, like I call him someone who was close to who's having a ringside view of history and events that were going on. So when he comes into the 1980s, he finds himself as a Western Army commander.
Right.
Blue Star was about to happen. Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale and his militants had occupied the temple complex.
Yeah.
Now, what had happened was that the political failure of the state administration, the central government, had made Bhindranwale this big monster
Yes.
who was moving around in cities with swords and guns, whose followers, militants, had occupied several gurdwaras which are not known about. We talk about the Golden Temple complex. There are other gurdwaras that were also occupied there. So, there were several of these things that were going on at that time. When General Sundarji advises Mrs. Gandhi, I'll keep it short in terms of how it happened. So, the inevitability of army's action was very much laid at the army's door. So it was inevitable that the army had to take an action to flush out militants.
Yes.
There was another way that they could do it, was to lay siege around the Golden Temple. Now that could not happen because when I spoke with General Bulbul Barar, his view, and I agree with him there, is that they had thought of declaring Khalistan 4-5 days later, which meant that the army needed to go in and do what they needed to do. We are always wiser in hindsight. But the fact is, the operation in Golden Temple ended the career and life and rise of the most dangerous militant the Khalistan movement, the Punjab militancy has seen ever. Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, he was a massive monster that he had become. So I think that set the movement back. Though, of course, lots of things happened and I don't want to go into Black Thunder and others. But I think it paved the way for an easier operation later on in Punjab, and that was General Sundarji's doing. Blue Star ended in a bloodbath. Was never considered as a victory as far as the Indian Army is concerned. It was a sad event, and General Sundarji has said that in interviews that we went there with folded hands.
Yes.
The thing is, he found himself there in Punjab amidst the Blue Star operation, taking a call, taking a decision, which led to Mrs. Gandhi's death later because at the hands of her Sikh bodyguards. Now, the militancy movement had been scuttled by the Blue Star operation, but it led to a lot of other things, and we've been dealing with that for years later. So Sundarji found himself again at a juncture where he took a call.
Yes.
One of the things that I must say with all of these events is that he was decisive.
Yes.
And that decision perhaps led to a certain outcome. That outcome led to an assassination or death. No way linking him to that. But the fact is, interesting part is that he was decisive in each of these events. Decisive. He never shrank back, or he never had 2-3 opinions on it. He had that one thought, opinion, which he carried through. Blue Star was one. Then comes Bofors.
Right.
Bofors, he had to choose a gun. They initially chose the Austrian gun, but the Austrian gun encountered issues. The barrel burst. Second was a French Sofma gun, for which the Americans had supplied the gun locating radars to Pakistan, so that had to be discarded. Number 3 was Bofors, which General Sundarji chose. Now, after Bofors was chosen, there was some issue in Sweden because Olof Palme was facing political issues and opposition from the companies and the opposition as well, the parties politically. And he was in a very different stage of his career, very, very vulnerable stage of his career. One day, 4 months later, I think 4 or 5 months later, he was returning from a movie theater with his wife, and an assassin pops up from the shadows and shoots him dead.
Right.
Now, this is again a happenstance. I call it a happenstance that, the Bofors was chosen, the gun was chosen. It became a huge controversy, of which one of the few people who came out unscathed was General Sundarji and Arun Singh.
Right.
There were lots of questions asked, and I talk about what General Sundarji's response to all of that was. His response was very upright, sincere, and clear. Again, that clarity of purpose emerges in all these events. Decisiveness, clarity of purpose as a personality. Bofors, Blue Star, and then we spoke about Brasstacks a bit while ago. Brasstacks, he decides to mount this kind of an exercise, and he has his plans upon which the Pakistanis get rattled. It brings the president of Pakistan into India for cricket diplomacy, for proposing peace with Rajiv Gandhi and starting talks between India and Pakistan for demilitarization of the LOC and the Siachen Glacier. So all of those happens, and then Ziaul Haq, 9 months later, he is bumped off. He's assassinated while returning from a parade in Bawalpur. Now that is again an outcome of a decisive move to amass 500,000 troops and do this exercise Brasstacks. So that is the other assassination. And then you had Op Pavan, the outcome of which, again, we spoke about Op Pavan, where Sundarji decides to advise Rajiv Gandhi to go to Sri Lanka. Not advise Rajiv Gandhi, but he advises Rajiv Gandhi that if there was a situation that the LTTE militarily opposed the Indian army, they would be decimated in 2 to 3 weeks. Years later, 2-3 weeks had passed. Sundarji retires, but LTT is still on. They go on to kill Rajiv Gandhi. Prabhakaran and his men are able to kill Rajiv Gandhi. So I think one of the things, again, that comes out here is that decisiveness to go to Sri Lanka, which did not come out well. But the outcome of Op Pavan and Sri Lanka IPKF campaign was the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. The fifth one, which is the death of General Vaidya, the only army chief to have been assassinated. Though it had happened after his retirement, but he was in Pune when he was killed by assailants. Again, an outcome of Blue Star, of which General Sundarji was a part.
Awesome. So, last question. What do you think General Sundarji should be remembered as? An underrated genius or a flawed genius?
I don't think he was underrated at any rate. I think, let's say, he left behind a legacy which was profound, deep, and also disputed. I think I would put it this way: profound, deep, disputed, and unresolved.
Yes.
I would also say the fifth part of this is that I think he was the only military leader who influenced the political thinking, the political decisions in a democracy such as India. No one has before him, no one after him. And he impacted and influenced the entire decade of events. The last thing I would like to talk about him is that he was India's modernizer general. That is something that he brought about. Where we are today is something because of General Sundarji, and that is where credit is due.
Absolutely. So this was the story of General Sundarji, the man who modernized Indian army and yet who remained for some reasons a controversial army general. Nonetheless, this is a very, very interesting story of a man, General Sundarji, whom, as I realized, people don't know much about, and many things were a surprise, a complete shock for me. If you're really interested in the history of India, the military history of India, this is a book which must be on your bookshelf. Probal sir, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. I really enjoyed. Thank you for having me over. Thank you.